One of the biggest challenges for me when I came to sort of working specifically with international multilingual writers was trying to assess their level of comprehension, especially with sort of key terms that we take for granted as writing instructors. So coming from, an American educational model, we have these assumptions that a lot of the key terms we use and the process pedagogies that we rely on are familiar to our students. And in fact, they are not at all familiar to our students. And I think maybe sort of conceptually, many of us recognize that, but then in practice, I don't think we are, I realized at least that I wasn't slowing down enough and defining terms and defining concepts. So for example, if we say you're going to turn in a first draft of this assignment, students really don't understand what a first draft means, not only really about the expectations of the first draft, but all of the pedagogical and curricular reasons for process-based writing. So that's one example. Another example that would be really familiar to many of our students who come from American high schools is like writing a reflective response. So saying, I want you to just reflect on so-and-so, or even like, I want you to write an analysis of this article. A lot of those terms that we just use so often and all the time when we talk about writing are not familiar, and either they're not familiar just because of the definition itself, or they're just not familiar to students in terms of writing-based pedagogy. Most of our students are coming from cultures where it's like teacher-centered, where it's test-based, where those are the kinds of assessments that they're really familiar with. And then they come into a writing-intensive culture where writing is the major form of assessment, both of comprehension and of skills. And students aren't familiar with that, and so we need to, I realized that I needed to slow down and explain that culture, that academic culture, the writing pedagogy culture, and the expectations for all of our writing assignments by defining key terms, slowing down, giving them very, very explicit guidelines for what we're expecting.
One area that I feel like is challenging for me, even with the background that I have, is trying to work with students to get past the anxiety they have around language, partially because of their background in learning language. Being, as Anna mentioned, so test-focused, they're waiting for a very isolated grammar lesson. They're waiting for a vocabulary quiz. They're waiting for like a very explicit language moment or activity, and that the field of teaching English has shifted so much that really we've come to realize that teaching grammar in isolation is not helpful. Teaching vocabulary out of context is not helpful. And so students who come from sort of older pedagogical language models are used to that, and by default I think give value to that kind of teaching and learning. So they come to Mason, and we're so innovative, and we have embedded all of our language instruction in content and in composition, and brought together these pedagogical approaches in really awesome and interesting ways. But the students are still waiting for the language test and the vocabulary quiz. And so it's hard for them to, I think, see that their language is improving and see that the approach that they're experiencing is of benefit to them. And when they can't identify where the language lesson is, from my experience, they feel like a lot of anxiety around, am I making progress towards my goals? Especially here and at most institutions where there are requirements to pass a proficiency test at the end. They want to know that every scrap of what they're getting in this class is going to help them pass that ultimate high-stakes test that comes at the end. So I guess that would be my biggest challenge. It's not specifically about writing, but I think it kind of gets in the way of students experiencing the writing pedagogy as we're presenting it in the pathway programs and in the stretched composition class and other approaches to teaching language on this campus. Their anxiety can kind of get in the way of really deeply experiencing that pedagogical approach in the classroom. So one thing I've done in my class, which might not be relevant to other faculty who aren't in a language classroom, is to make that pedagogy more explicit to them. You can learn English like this, you can learn English like this, you can learn English like that. Here's where we are, here's how we're learning it, here's what's going to happen by the end of this semester, by the end of this year, even though I'll never give you a decontextualized grammar quiz. So that's been a challenge, but kind of a fun one too.